So to begin, a native of South Carolina, Walter Russell Mead, a Yale graduate who went on to teach American foreign policy at his alma mater. Mr. Mead is the James Clarke Chace Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Barnet College, located in New York's Hudson Valley. He's also a distinguished scholar in American strategy and statesmanship at the Hudson Institute. While well-known to devotees of the Wall Street Journal, for which he is a global view columnist, Mr. Mead also is a prolific author whose books include Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World, written back over 20 years ago in 2001. This work focuses on the Jacksonian tradition in American politics. Mr. Mead's subsequently highly acclaimed book, God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World, was published in 2007. It examined the Anglo-American tradition of world power since the 17th century. His most recent publication is Ark of the Covenant, the United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People. Mr. Mead also is a regular contributor to Foreign Affairs. I'll close this introduction with a quick story concerning Mr. Mead's perhaps unintended role in the volatile reality of international relations. No stranger to intellectual controversy, in February 2020, he authored an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal for which the journal's editors decided on the title, quote, "China is the real sick man of Asia," close quote. Not unsurprisingly, a brouhaha ensued, and the PRC denounced Mr. Mead's opinion piece as racist. In retaliation, the PRC expelled 3 Wall Street Journal reporters, an incident that many of us remember. We welcome Mr. Mead to address and interact with our council members, and we look forward to a stimulating interchange with Mr. Mead. Thank you.
Well, I was not going to bring up that. But since you do, I maybe add a little bit more that PRC, you know, it soon became apparent when the PRC expelled American journalists from virtually every newspaper that they were looking for an excuse, a pretext, and possibly connected to the spread of COVID. They just didn't want any foreigners looking too closely. But they also, they tried pretty systematically to bring a premature end to my career. They tried to organize a email campaign to get me fired from Bard College as a racist. They threatened the administration with Bard of cutting off all their access to Chinese students and cooperation with Chinese educational programs if, quote, the infection was not removed. And they certainly tried with the journal. I think they knew better than to try very hard with Hudson Institute. So, and actually, what saved me was in the first place the strong spine of Leon Botstein, the president of the college, who basically responded to China and said, "Our professors say many things and have many opinions on many topics. None of them reflect the position of the university, nor is it the university's concern to police their expression." The student campaign on email to have me sort of banned as a racist ended when the many former students of mine who are Chinese told their friends and spread a counter campaign. "We've studied with Professor Mead. He's not a racist." So it was very interesting for me, a really interesting lesson of how things do and don't work. And I should probably say, I don't know how it's going to end, but a week ago, I was, the Chinese embassy here reached out and asked if I would have a one-on-one meeting with the ambassador, which is scheduled for next week. So we shall see, right? We shall see whether I emerge from the inside. I'm making sure everyone knows where I am. But it is, I think, interesting that that perhaps they are reconsidering at least some things. when you're the global view columnist, it's actually kind of one of the easier jobs in the world because, you know, something somewhere interesting happens in any given week. If you're the tax policy columnist, there are weeks when it's really hard to come up with something. You know, there are boring weeks in politics, but in world affairs, there's never a boring week. But usually the problem is what to pick, because there's so many things you could write about, and you're trying to think, what do my readers want and need to know the most about? I have a little bit of the same problem thinking about how to speak with you today, is there's so many things we could talk about. And so what I've sort of settled on is, as a columnist, I've learned to be brief. And so I'm going to try to be brief up here and just lay out a couple of big picture thoughts and then let your questions and comments shape the discussion, because you are all people who know your own minds. And you know what you want and need to hear about much better than I do. So, big picture thoughts. We're all, I think, feeling rather chuffed these days by Vladimir Putin's miscalculations and resulting failure in Ukraine. And it is a wonderful failure so far, I should say. And it is a wonderful thing to remember and be reminded of an important truth in international affairs, which is the other side makes mistakes too. We're very much aware as a society, by our culture, by our media, and so on, of the things that we get wrong, and we get a lot of things wrong. But other people do too. In my book, Special Providence, one of the sort of key questions that drove me to write that book was my perception that if you actually go back and you look at the history of American foreign policy, there are two things that emerge as constant, going really back to the administration of George Washington. The first is that everybody everywhere, including in the United States, basically thinks that the Americans simply are no good at foreign policy. John Adams wrote it, George Washington said, if there's anything that's going to break up the Union, it's going to be foreign policy. I think de Tocqueville said, success in foreign policy requires all of the qualities in which the American Republic is deficient and none of the qualities in which it excels. And you can sort of, European statesmen for generations have mocked the lack of sophistication and subtlety, the moralism, the ignorance, the swings between isolation and crazy ambition in American foreign policy. And frankly, they've been right much of the time. And in the United States, we've had no shortage of intellectuals, popular figures, and others bewailing and bemoaning the exquisitely horrific state of our foreign policy. And we certainly have a long list of failures to which you can point. But the other thing that is true is that if you think about the international system in terms of power dynamics, really the most pronounced single trend in the international system since the American Declaration of Independence has been the rise to global predominance of the United States. And so a lot of my work is predicated on trying to understand, why is it that something that actually works rather well compared to the other efforts out there? The Habsburgs used to laugh at how foolish they were. Metternich thought we were idiots and couldn't do anything. Where is the Habsburg Empire? Where is France's superpower status? Where is Russia's? They've all in turn sort of pointed to the flaws of our society and our inability, and yet in the end, at least so far, our flag is still there. We still stand. And that does to some degree maybe guide my thinking that the United States may be stronger than we think and have a brighter future than we think, even though it looks dark. Just over the period of my own life, I think it's safe to say that with the exception of a handful of years, America has been in decline since the day I was born. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that coincidence means causality, but some of my students would tell you that's probably true. But, when I was born, the country, I grew up in the 50s, when they changed the way every American studied math because of the Sputnik. The Soviets were teaching math, the Americans weren't. We were utterly failing, we were doomed. The Soviet bulldozer was going to roll over our pathetic innumerate selves. So we had to learn a bunch of things like set theory and Mayan number counting. I'm not sure how that saved the Republic, but apparently we're still here. Then we had the 1960 election. Remember the missile gap? The Soviets were ahead of us and they were going to destroy us. The missile gap, you know, somehow we survived that, but then came the balance of payments deficit. And President Kennedy said, I'm more worried about the balance of payments deficit than I am about the Soviet nuclear weapons. I don't know if the Cuban Missile Crisis changed his perception or not, but, you know, and immediately after that, we go into the Vietnam War. When America, you know, our innocence is lost forever. We are just, you know, we will never recover our position. Our society's been rent asunder. The civil rights movement, oh, woe, alas, alack. And then just when we're sort of past some of that, Watergate, our institutions have been destroyed. You know, we are completely helpless as a people. Woe is us. Almost immediately after that, it's followed by Japan, the emerging superpower. America will be helpless before the power, you know, rising power of Japan. Pretty soon after that, well, the real winner of the Cold War turned out to be Germany. And the European Union is the superpower that will shape the future. And the euro will replace the dollar. And it's just going to go on and on. And of course, then China kind of stepped into that role. And we don't know where that's going. But my point is we've always been in decline. And yet, what was it Orwell used to say? The dark night of fascism is always falling on the United States, but landing on Europe. So somehow we're still here. I think So I am, in spite of the fact that I'll say a couple of somewhat dark-sounding, pessimistic things, I'm fundamentally someone who is not a consumer of America the Doomed theory. I think there's something in us, a kind of a resilience, and perhaps the fact that we are such worrywarts that we continually examine our failings and try and figure out what to do about them may help us survive and thrive. But I'd say also, more substantively, perhaps, when people think about American power and the American system, they and worry about its imminent demise. What they're unconsciously doing often, I think, is comparing our international system to earlier systems and empires that existed in the past. And if you think about ancient Egypt or ancient Babylon or ancient China or whatever, once a society kind of reaches a certain level of power, a status quo power is really a status quo power at that point. They don't want anything to change. And any change is a change for the worse. So the aim of power is stability. And the test of power is the ability to preserve stability, internally and externally. The American system is built on capitalism. And capitalism is fundamentally a revolutionary force. And it upends international balances of power. Some countries rise and fall. Regional, cultural, political things rise and fall. Capitalism is a system of incessant changes. If the American system is succeeding and capitalism is going forward as an innovative, world-altering force, the world is going to be in upheaval. If everything stopped changing, that would actually be a sign of American failure rather than American success. And so by interpreting change as a threat to stability, I think we underestimate the durability, the resilience, and the power of the American system. That said, there is a lot of instability out there. And I'll just point, I think, to a couple of things that do concern me in terms of American foreign policy that I think we'll need to think about. One of them is the public withdrawal of confidence in the American foreign policy establishment. If you think about the 2016 and 2020 presidential races, if you add the Trump vote together with the Sanders primary vote, you get a solid majority of voters in both elections rejecting the status quo. And voters voting for candidates who fundamentally disagree with what's seen as the kind of consensus post-Cold War and even post-World War II form of American foreign policy. And in that sense, the United States is a little bit like Macron's France, where a majority of the French want anti-establishment candidates, but because they can't agree on which anti-establishment candidate they want, Macron continues to flood. All right, and in some ways, President Biden is an American Macron that way. But and that's a good thing in many ways, perhaps. But it's also a dangerous thing in that these leaders are weak. Macron cannot push French public opinion too far, and I think President Biden also encounters very tough limits on what kinds of things he can do. So the lack of confidence in the ideas and the capabilities, frankly, of the American foreign policy establishment and its judgment are very deep, and there is severe check on what American presidents and what the American State Department and other agencies can do. And it's sadly, this lack of confidence is not totally without foundation. You know, if you'd asked a room full of foreign policy experts in 1990, what will be the effects of free trade with Canada, with China and Mexico? They'd say free trade will make China and Mexico democratic and Americans rich, right? And you would have been pretty much pushed out of the room if you'd said anything different. So, to a very considerable extent, the American foreign policy establishment has been wrong about basic elements, foundational elements of American foreign policy. I am not against free trade, and I'm not against democracy. But I think the relationship between free trade, democracy, peace, and American policy is a complicated one, not a simple one. And I think by failing to embrace a more complex view, a nuanced view of how all these things work together, the American foreign policy establishment has set itself up for a place where someone like former President Trump can basically run on a campaign of the emperor has no clothes, and people look at the emperor and agree he's naked. It's, by the way, it's also true that the little boy could also be naked. Who says that? You can have a kind of naked whistleblower calling the emperor naked. And we may have had such a situation here in the United States, but nevertheless, the foreign policy establishment has lost public confidence, not because the public misunderstands, but because the public understands. The same thing, obviously, you know, I'll talk to people under 50, and they'll say things like, well, you know, I don't remember America ever winning a war. America's been at war my whole life, and we've never won one. Right? And that becomes a very important perception for people when they think about what American foreign policy should look like. So those of us who come, you know, who remember an era when occasionally we did win a war or two, if we were lucky and the wind was blowing in the right direction, need to think about a younger generation whose worldview has been shaped by a very different set of events. So this, I think, is one serious thing that we need to think hard about. Another one is, and maybe I'll stop after this, that there are a lot of ways in which American foreign policy, despite all the talk of pivots to Asia and so on, remains profoundly Eurocentric, in some ways good, in some ways bad. But there remains a kind of a sense that European history is normative for the world. That is, that the process of development, of economic, social, and political development that brought Europe to where it is today is what the rest of the world is doing. And that, this is, you know, we have the expression developed countries and developing countries, which has this kind of teleological view of history embedded in it. Or even a term like emerging democracy is that, you know, we say the Philippines are an emerging democracy. Sometimes I'm tempted to say whenever you hear emerging, substitute not a. You will actually get a more accurate reading of events. It is not at all clear today that the world is converging toward sort of liberal, secular, somewhat secular values along a European, Anglo-American, or Atlantic line. I don't think India's BJP party is moving India in this direction. Despite Erdogan's economic problems, I don't necessarily see Turkey moving toward being, there seem to be fewer people in Turkey who want to be more like Europe today than there were 20 years ago. Brazil, much of Africa, we can see it some in the lack of enthusiasm for the Ukrainian position among many developing countries. 20 years ago, you would go to China and hear from all kinds of experts and even people working in the government that China was hoped to become a normal Western country one of these days. And the difference was because it was so large, it needed to move more slowly. And you would actually, you know, people believe this. Fewer seem to believe that now. And maybe in the long run, we all go back to some kind of convergent world. But I think in terms of policy making, we're moving away from that. I had a conversation with the Indian Foreign Minister, Shankar, just right before COVID. And he said, listen, if American foreign policy wants to help us defend ourselves from China, we're for that. We're with you. But if what you want to do is universalize the West and westernize the rest of the world, we want no part of that. So this is actually going to be a difficult thing for American foreign policy process. In the Cold War, because the center of gravity in the Cold War was the Atlantic and Western Europe, even though there were lots of elements of it that were outside, fundamentally creating what Wilsonians would consider an alliance of democracies, NATO. I mean, admittedly, Franco and Salazar were in it at various points, and the Greek colonels, but on the whole, NATO was an alliance of democracies bound together to promote democracy and a specific sort of Western concept of what democracy was. The core strategic thrust of our foreign policy and the core ideological thrust of American society were easier to align in the Cold War than they may be in an era where we need to look for countries like India, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, which, while democratic, is democratic in a very different way from us. And we may find it harder to get everything working in the same way. That's going to make problems domestically in terms of selling an American foreign policy in Indo-Pacific. It'll also make it difficult. We'll have to think very differently about what the nature of our alliances are and how do we make them work. We can do this, it's just going to be hard. So those are a couple of thoughts that I have, and I'm happy to go on at any length about any other topics that are on your minds. Thank you.
So, Joyce, if you'll go around with the microphone to start with and pass the cues.
Mr. Mead, thank you for a wonderful presentation. You've been writing, I think, 2 columns a week for the journal recently since the Ukraine crisis, Ukraine invasion, and we've been discussing Ukraine all morning. Perhaps you could fit into the references you just made, so framework you just analyzed, offered us, your thoughts about what Ukraine means and signifies for the international system today.
Well, it's, you know, it's a little bit like asking after the first act of a play.
How does it end?
Yeah, and we, you know, I mean, we should remember that, you know, war is by its very nature unpredictable and full of surprises. So far, Mr. Putin's surprises have been largely unpleasant, ours have been largely pleasant. Who knows whether that will characterize the next stages of the war, though I certainly hope so. Look, I do worry a good deal about where things might head on this. I am happy to see Russia being defeated, and the word humiliated comes to mind. And that, you know, I'm happy for every blow Vladimir Putin's prestige receives, and I'm inspired by the sense of Ukrainian resistance. I do wonder whether some of my friends who tell me that nationalism is an evil force, how they reconcile that with their sudden enthusiasm for Ukraine. And I would say what we can actually see at work in this war is both faces of nationalism. A Russian nationalism which seems to feel the need to oppress, invade, and add, and a Ukrainian nationalism which seeks to defend itself and to exist. What this tells us, should tell us, by the way, is that nationalism is such a powerful force in human psyche that you cannot do very much without taking it into account. And I hope, you know, that, you know, some people talk about the European Union as a cosmopolitan organization. That's a little strong. And the Europeans are trying to create a nation of Europe that people will feel as strongly about the European nation as they do with their own. I have no idea whether that will succeed. It will take time and hard, but it happened. We once had 13 colonies and they became a nation. Still, so first point is that nationalism is here to stay, and we should all take that to heart. And that is that complicates the task of American foreign policy. Next, I would say, what I worry about at this point is a kind of a dynamic where the administration, which has made some good calls on it, I'm not trying to make some sort of a blanket criticism here, has, I think, been a little quick to get its own prestige entangled. If we ask ourselves, what would happen if the Russian offensive started to work in the Donbass? And in spite of everything we were shipping, they were making gains. Could the Biden administration throw in its hands and say, well, we tried, we did our best, gave it our best shot, oh well, now we'll try to negotiate a loser's peace which will save as much of Ukraine as possible? That would be seen as a pretty terrible defeat for the United States and for broader for the Biden administration. And it would be a bitter political pill. I don't think they necessarily thought, I think they made a lot of small decisions without realizing where this put them, right? And at the same time, obviously, the Russians, Putin feels that he cannot afford to lose. So a confrontation between two nuclear powers where neither one is able to accept defeat this is why I wrote a piece not long ago saying, you know, this is the kind of thing that can lead you to a Cuban Missile Crisis type of crisis. A zero-sum competition between two nuclear powers. I'm not saying that that's going to happen or has to happen, but I think that events have moved in the direction that increases the odds of that, and I don't think people have fallen through. The other thing that I fear has happened is that it's no secret that a lot of folks in the Biden administration are sort of temperamentally and emotionally Atlanticists in their orientation. They may intellectually understand the need for an Indo-Pacific foreign policy, but their vision of what the world ought to be like and what feels right is Atlanticist. And I don't think you can build an American global power on an entirely Atlanticist ideological foundation. And I fear that some people have been so enthused and galvanized by the resurgence of NATO, the new activism or apparent activism, I think we still have to use that term when we speak of Germany, in Europe, that they are over-interpreting what this means for the liberal West is back. I still think it is true that the liberal West is no longer large enough or strong enough to dominate the course of world history the way it used to. An American foreign policy, which must be global, must take into account these changing circumstances.
So, Ambassador Jim Rosenthal made an instance that he Ambassador Rosenthal was ambassador to Romania, and he is not an actively practicing thespian. He's an actively practicing politician.
Wow. And that's a little bit of a, thank you for the kind introduction. I want to pick up a little bit, because you talked earlier, big picture, about the foreign policy establishment of the United States losing confidence in the American people. On another occasion, I'll argue with you a little bit about that, but that's not the frame of my question. There is this view that Putin thought that Putin thought that there was all the divisions of the United States, that we lost our get up and go, et cetera. And that was a reason why he decided to do this. And that he has been surprised at all the stuff that we see around us in terms of unity in the United States, but also with Europe, the European stuff you're talking about too. I'm just curious, A, how that fits into your big picture, long-term thinking, and miscalculation, obviously maybe miscalculation, but also related to China. How do you see the response of the United States, the response of NATO? Frankly, some people argue that the response of the Ukrainians could be the Taiwanese. So I'd like to address that issue, what's happened, how does that affect the bigger picture? Thank you.
To understand that, we have to start with how does American foreign policy, public opinion work in American foreign policy? And obviously that's a very complicated question. But I think we've got, in special problems, I talk about 4 different schools of thought among Americans about kind of what kind of country we are and what our foreign policy should therefore be. And there's one school I call Hamiltonian, which sort of, like Alexander Hamilton looked at and said, what's the most successful country in the world? Well, Great Britain. And how does it do it? It has a strong Bank of England, a close connection with the sort of big companies and the national government, and a strong navy. And that makes you rich enough so that you can maintain your freedom at home. Then you have the Wilsonian view, which, it's the ideals of America, and we should spread, and our foreign policy is about spreading our ideals, and we can only be safe when everybody's democratic, because bad government creates war and so on and so forth. Then you have what I call the Jeffersonians, who say the more we get in, think of somebody like Ron Paul as a modern day Jeffersonian, the more we get involved in foreign adventures, the bigger the federal government becomes at home, the bigger the debt is, and the more you divide America into classes. And so we need an unambitious American foreign policy abroad in order to keep us with a small, unambitious federal government at home and preserve our liberty, which after all is the most important thing. And then you have folks I call Jacksonians for Andrew Jackson. They're probably the largest group in the population, not a majority, they're probably something about 40%, sort of the core Trump vote, we might say. And they don't really care if foreigners believe in one God or no God, or Democrats or not Democrats. They believe in live and let live unless somebody attacks the United States or our treaty allies, at which point they basically want to nuke us. And they want a fast, decisive war, no holds barred. And they want to win by unconditional surrender, and that's it. And what I think Putin, there are problems is most people who do American foreign policy professionally are either Hamiltonian or Wilson. and live in hope of creating either a world commercial order based on free trade or a world liberal order based on human rights, right? And so they're motivated by hope, right? Whereas where more Americans are motivated by fear, and really don't want to mess with foreigners unless the foreigners mess with us, and then they want us to really wrong. All right, there's certain countries that for historical reasons, American Jacksonians consider enemy countries. Russia is one of them, thanks to the Cold War. And Putin triggered a Jacksonian response in Ukraine. It's not an upsurge of American love of liberal ideology. Right? Otherwise, Biden's polls would be going up and Trump's would be going way down, and we're like back with the EU, and let's, that's not what's happening about what's coming with the midterms. All right, it's more that the Jacksonian threat response, the response that wanted to nuke Afghanistan for Osama bin Laden, that has been triggered. Okay, and Putin, I think, made the mistake which others have made. In peace, Jacksonians look a lot like Jeffersonians. If they're not threatened, they're both not interested in foreign policy and don't want to do anything, except maybe have a big military. So, so America in peacetime often looks like a very isolationist, placid place. And people over and over again have been tempted into actions that trigger that Jacksonian response, right? That, I think, is what that was Putin's miscalculation in America, and other ones in Europe. And so it would be a mistake for Wilsonians, and this is something that worries me, because the Biden administration, the activist wing of the Democratic Party in foreign affairs is essentially Wilsonian, those Hamiltonian elements.
I think so.
Yeah. And as is Blinken, Chace Sullivan may be a little different, but and if you're going to get Democratic Party support for an activist foreign policy, it has to be couched in Wilsonian terms. Otherwise, they don't want any part of it. So that's why I worry that there will be a kind of a reciprocal misinterpretation, and they'll think that there's more support for Wilsonian policy than there is. I don't think there's much. So that's kind of where, and that's a classic problem with American foreign policy. And again, what it means from the standpoint of foreign policy elites in general, American public opinion either doesn't want to do enough about something, or it wants to do something too hard and in the wrong way. And so the foreign policy establishment is constantly trying to rank, either stir the beast up or calm it down. So that would be my sense.
General White. Mr. Mead, your encyclopedic and embracing sense of the world is so beautifully expressed as a lunch carries over here. We thank you for that. This touches on your Jacksonian frame that you were just making. And this may not work, but I wonder if you'd wrestle with it for a moment. The nationalism that you talked about is perhaps not born of, but it is stoked by fear, or fear of aggression, actual aggression, true in 1776, true in 9/11. And for Russia now mobilizing its move into Ukraine, it's because it's really a defensive action. So if threat mobilizes nationalism and tribalism, they're so close. Is this the time to find a way to reduce the threat that Putin feels, or in fact amplify it to an unknown end?
I would say, look, in dealing with Russia, two things I would suggest you all do, by the way. Some of you I'm sure know more about Russia than I do, so this will sound like teaching my grandmother to suck eggs. But there's a wonderful mini-series, actually show on Amazon Prime, The Rise of Catherine the Great. It's actually made by, supported by the Russian Ministry of Information. Has wonderful production values, is in Russian and other languages with English subtitles. but it gives the kind of, this is Putin PBS. This is the way Putin would like to see, and probably sees himself, would like educated Russians to see the world. Every foreigner that appears in this series hates Russia and is in some way trying to get Russia. The Russians who foreigners despise, the most despicable Russians, and foreigners despise them as much as the Russians do, are the Russians who want to pathetically ape the West. Ugh, horrible. And then there are only two kinds of Russian officials. They're all corrupt. You can't do anything without corrupt officials because there's no other kind. But they're corrupt officials who really sincerely love Russia. And they're corrupt officials who get bribed by the foreigners to undermine Russia. And the Tsar's job is to clean out the bad corrupt officials and to police, but nevertheless work with the good corrupt officials. It's a wonderful show, well worth watching. And I think it just teaches you a lot about a certain vision of the world. And it's really entertaining TV and a great bodice-ripping drama. The other thing to do is to go back and reread George Kennan's Long Telegram, which is an excerpt from Foreign Affairs. I actually, as someone who writes essays on foreign affairs, nothing is more depressing than the history of that essay. In the sense that in 1989, you probably all remember, and many of you, like me, are old enough to remember, that when the wall came down, everybody in the West said two things. One, Kennan was a genius. You know, he understood, he developed this theory in 1949, and after 40 years it worked and they fell without firing a shot. Yay! Yay, Kennan. But then on the other hand, everybody said, and now that communism is gone, we can be friends with Russia. Well, the whole point of Kennan's essay in the Sources of Soviet Conduct is our problem with these people is not that they are communists, it is that they are Russian. So you can be hailed as the greatest genius in the history of American foreign policy and have people, without batting an eye, swallow policy prescriptions that are exactly the ones you most forcefully warned against. So the fit between America and Russia is a hard one. It's not impossible. In the past, we have managed to, really the first 100 years we got along fine with the Russians. By 1890, it was getting worse, but for the first 100 years, we got along very well with them. Part of the problem that we often don't get, and by the way, I think we don't get this about other countries as well as Russia, Iran is one, and there are others, is they need and want a hostile relationship with the United States. The government does not want to be friends. They do not want win-win, because the foundation of their political strength at home is I am defending my endangered people in a hostile world. If there's no hostile world, why is there democracy? Oh, no democracy. Why am I president for life? Why do all my cronies get billions of dollars? There's no good reason for that. So Putin needs, just as Kennan said, Stalin needed a hostile relationship with the United States. And it's interesting that for 20 years, there's been a huge policy argument in the Russian elite, where I think the smarter people, including people like Kudrin, have consistently argued the only way forward for Russia is rapid economic development. The only way we can do this is to integrate economically with Europe, and the only way we can do that is drop all this crazy political stuff and just get down to brass tacks. Let's get rich, and then we'll talk about anything we might or might not like in the European order. But for now, let's make friends and work. And for 20 years, Putin has basically prevented that tendency from dominating Russian foreign policy for good reasons. So I don't think the option of convincing Putin that we love him down deep is a realistic one, even if the state of our own public opinion made it impossible. I am not yet prepared to say that we can't come to a reasonable discussion. This is Kennan's thing. You can't make friends with the Russians, you can make deals with them that both sides will keep, but you can only do that by stopping them. You know, they realize they cannot get X because you will prevent it. So we're back to the war in Ukraine, where it's being decided on the battlefield. Now, right now, we're all very enthusiastic and happy about Ukraine. But I think if you think about a long war and the capacity of the Ukrainian state, which was universally believed to have very little capability before the war, can it manage the stress of a long war? Now, the Ukrainian military has performed admirably, and Ukrainian public opinion has backed the military. I don't know very much about how the Ukrainian, the economic management, degree of corruption, etc. I certainly know that before the war, Ukrainian political parties were the shadows of oligarchs. And the corruption was endemic and the cynicism was large. Again, Ukraine had 3 revolutions, but had not built a state. Now they have an army, which is the fundamental backbone of the state. We Wilsonians might not like to admit it, but if you don't have an army, you don't have a state. And often the nature of your army determines the nature of your state. They have an army. But can they build a state? Can they survive a long war? How long, the Ukrainian economy is going to collapse. We lose about 45% versus at most 15% in Russia. How long will we and the Europeans pump billions of dollars a month into the Ukrainian economy? Of all things that make corruption more endemic, large transfers of foreign aid are among the worst for producing corruption and inefficiency. What will happen in Ukrainian society as some people are seen to be getting richer, much richer as a result of the war, while other people are losing everything they have? How does if it's a long war of attrition, how well do things hold up, et cetera, et cetera? I don't have answers to these questions. And I can think of very optimistic, happy ways they'll work. But I wonder, for example, Europe is going to have a really horrible time, or seems to be headed for war. Oil prices are high. That's terrible for every European economy. Food prices are going to be high, which is going to be hard for just about everybody except for France, maybe Poland, and a couple of others. The ECB is tightening monetary policy at a time when debts are bad. The global economic condition is bad. How long will the Italians be okay with the EU sending money to Ukraine that it's not sending to Italy, Portugal, Spain, Greece? The Germans, I don't think, have not discovered an enthusiasm for shelling out more money in Europe. I don't know that you'll be able to make the argument in Germany, we should bail out Italy in order to block Putin in Ukraine. I'm not sure they're ready for that argument. So a long war, and by the way, the Middle East is going to be, the wheat prices in the Middle East are going up. With COVID and tourism having hit a lot of places, Africa is not going to be in good shape. We're going to see a lot of distress in the world, a lot of calls on resources and attention in the foreign policy universe. So a war of the course of a war of attrition in Ukraine is, in my mind, very much an open question. Russia will have its problems too. Hopefully they'll be bad ones. But they won't be the only people who have trouble as the war goes on. As late as 1864, the Confederacy could conceivably have won the Civil War. So we don't know. And that also makes it different. So if we can't hold Putin in Ukraine, or put another way, if our bottom line is somehow that the negotiated end we seek in Ukraine is going to be, will legalize Putin's hold of pre-2014 seizures in exchange for a peace treaty and presumably end of all sanctions. Putin will have lost the war in Ukraine to gain international recognition of Crimea. It's not a defeat. But you know, how does it end is always a good question to ask in war. And you can never know completely, but I think the conventional wisdom in Washington, which before the war started, was that Ukraine will be toast in 72 hours, very rapidly flipped to Putin can't abide this for long. I don't know, you know, I am no more enthusiastic about this iteration of conventional wisdom than I was about the preceding one.
How do you credit,
Or do you credit the possibility that you might not survive this, either politically or otherwise?
I am not in touch with Mr. Putin's physician, so I have absolutely no view on that topic. All men are mortal. Putin is a man, and that's about as far as I can go. In terms of his survival, hard to say. I think what we're hearing now is that if he's replaced, it won't be by a liberal, that it would be a split in the security forces by people who approve of the direction in which he was leading Russia, but believe he botched it. That is not the foundation for that. That is not hugely important. Now, maybe we would take the opportunity if the war were stalemated, Putin were overthrown by a coup in Russia. What we could all do is just to pretend to be really happy that the evil genius Putin is responsible for everything wrong he's done. And one thing to remember about war crimes trials is they are much less about providing real justice than they are that by saying, okay, these 10 people are guilty. You say these 10 million people are not. Yeah. You know, war crimes trials are basically about clearing the field to engage with the collaborators of the war crimes, much more than real justice. And so, you know, it would be in our interest. Again, we do not want this war to end with Russia permanently sanctioned, turned into a client of China. That is not a triumph of American foreign policy. So it would become in our interest to try to find a way to deal with a new Russian government, even if they were as nasty as before. But you know, the circumstances are all very difficult. We don't. It's war. We don't know what's going to happen next. But yes, I would. I don't see an easy. You know, presumably the new leadership would want to end the war, or at least reach a ceasefire. And if that's what they wanted to do, I would recommend that we try to work with them. Again, you get to the point of what if Zelensky doesn't want to accept the deal that we think works? Can we turn Zelensky from the inspiring partisan hero who we all admire to like this pesky obstacle to world peace? You know, and look, you don't understand. Giving them the Sudan land will make everything peaceful. You know, we actually, this war presents American foreign policy with more tricky issues, at least potentially, than I think most of the conventional wisdom gets. And certainly, by the way, more than American public opinion has been led to understand. Public opinion has been fed a very kind of one-dimensional and to some degree triumphalist as well as moralistic narrative of conflict, which creates big problems for policymakers if the course of the conflict leads us into a more difficult place.
Are there any more comments from the floor? If not, well, yes.
you got to ask
Yes, go.
a question. How do we get around, in your view,
Well, how do we get around this problem that we've got a principle in Europe and frankly globally that aggression should not yield a benefit. War should not yield a benefit. War crimes should not yield a benefit. And if you give up that principle, then you're opening the door to this over and over and over again, which I happen to believe is the case. And I think we're going to be at this for a very long time. But the problem you've got is that there's this instinct, as you have articulated, that we really got to settle this and get back to normal again. There's no way to do it other than giving Putin his negotiation, giving him his off-ramp, giving him his recognition of Crimea, giving him his sliver of Ukraine in return for peace. And I don't think Zelensky's on that game plan. Right. And so the question is, why should we be? Because if you open the door to a political benefit as a result of a war of aggression, you're certainly going to get everybody in the world, including the Chinese, say, well, we might not win everything, but we'll win something, so let's go.
Yeah. Part of it, I agree with you. But part of the problem is that, we used to have this problem in the Cold War. If the goal is to contain communism, then anywhere where the communists achieve power undermines our whole foreign policy, right? And that's, true to a certain extent. But that immediately became a problem for the Truman administration when they proclaimed that. Because, okay, we're containing communism in Europe, what about China? Are you going to contain, communism in China? That means you're going to send American troops to fight in China. Well, they didn't, but they found themselves 2 years later in a land war in Korea that, again, they didn't expect to be. The thing is, when you say that you're going to make your foreign policy on a global principle, you allow your adversary to choose exactly the place where it's easiest for them to prevail and hardest for you to defend. So you give up strategic control to the bad guys if you say we're going to do a hard and fast line everywhere. But on the other hand, if you give up these principles, how do you explain why am I fighting communism here if I just let it happen over here? Right? So the same thing this is with aggression. If we say that we are committed to that no act of aggression anywhere in the world can lead to a lasting benefit for the aggressor, we have suddenly said America is the global policeman. And in the last analysis, we are going to defend every boundary on Earth. American people are not up for that. They won't do it. And sooner or later, we'll find we've written a check that our bank won't honor. So I'm not saying there's some answer, I have this magical formula. What I'm saying, it's a dilemma that policymakers are constantly living with, and that no matter what you do, you're likely to find that your principle is going to be challenged in a way that is just very, very difficult to handle.
So we've been very fortunate to have with us today a profound thinker of the dimensions of Walter Russell Mead. It's been, I think, an excellent conference and with a superb conclusion. So we thank you for joining us today. As a token of appreciation, we present you with this is the tie.
Thank you very much.
Because I notice you wear ties, which is increasing rarity.
Increasing rarity.
Yeah, that's our.
This is beautiful, and I shall certainly wear it. Thanks and pride.
Thank you.